Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Larry, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining me again. We just ended up talking for like 20 minutes about Oswald off air. I love the JFK topic. I'm telling you, I think you can tell I'm probably hooked by now. But mostly I took your advice, and I think it's from our Bay of Pigs episode with Gary Hill that I kind of started looking into Kennedy's policies a little bit more. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions about Cuba, obviously, and just some other things to get some more context. I mean, I've dived into looking into how big of a fear communism was, so I can relate what that would be like to understand the experience, I guess. And the closest thing I could probably relate to would be like in the beginning of the pandemic, where everyone thought everybody was like gonna die like a Thanos snap. That seemed like what communism was. And the way I kind of look at this case right now is that you have a large amount of media that's been pushing this communism narrative for the longest time. You got to be tough on communism. And then you have a person that the president that gets killed. And now that ball you've been building up to a point where it's to fear communism and be strong on communism. Now everyone's thinking a communist killed the president. And now you have to look at attacking. And that's when we have this idea of we can't let there be conspiracy. So I want to talk about Cuba a little bit. I want to talk about the mafia connection with Cuba. The government was working with mafia agents. We know that by now. But there's a lot of individual actors that were involved in Cuba. Dulles, for one of them, a lot of CIA people and just government, I guess, military industrial complex that seem to have a lot of things going on in Cuba that Kennedy probably wasn't aware of. And I'm just very interested in learning more about if you can give me a breakdown of, I guess, some of the important factors going with Cuba, like our relations with Castro, our involvement of Jack Ruby running guns. I mean, I didn't even know that was true until recently. So I'm getting into this point where I start realizing there's weird lines and it all boils around the money asset, which is Cuba.
Well, and context is my thing, so I love it. So let's start walking through the characters. I mean, basically, the starting point is that the Batista regime was fundamentally corrupt. I mean, Batista was essentially in the pocket of two forces: American mercantile interest, the big firms that were doing business in Cuba. Mining was a major U.S. business in Cuba. Agriculture, ranching was a major U.S. business in Cuba. The biggest ranch in Texas had major holdings and investments in Cuba. And I think most people don't realize that. There were oil company investments in Cuba. So the American financial community was doing quite well in Cuba. And there were probably 7 or 8 firms that were very entrenched with the Batista regime. And to satisfy their needs, Batista had to be very negative towards things like agricultural reform or socialization of industries. So basically, commercial interests were probably at the found root of it all, which is why I think in one of our talks earlier, I mentioned when Castro, for example, started taking prisoners from American companies and holding them hostage for ransom. That was one of the things that he did that totally turned both the American financial community and the CIA against him, because they immediately felt that this was not just a sign of a revolutionary, but a sign of a communist, that Castro was against American investments in Cuba. He didn't care about them. He was willing to blackmail them. So that was a big deal. The other major connection to Batista was gambling. I mean, Cuba was Las Vegas before there was a Las Vegas. Everybody from the East Coast went to Cuba. the resorts, the hotels, the gambling centers. I mean, just as an example, one of the things that turned the Eisenhower administration, and this seems strange, against Cuba was Richard Nixon, like everybody else, went down there to gamble and hit the casinos. One of Richard Nixon's buddies went down and got badly cleaned out in one of the casinos where they were running illegal games. And Nixon just began making a case against, the Cuban casinos. The Cuban casinos went so far as Meyer Lansky said, this is not good for business. We can't have the American vice president putting us down. So he sent John Roselli, name that you're familiar with by now, down to Cuba to clean up the casinos, because Lansky was all about business. But I think the point that needs to be emphasized is, yeah, organized crime was in Cuba, but really the matter of fact is the major figures like Lansky who were in Cuba were there to do business in gambling. They weren't godfathers running crime networks in Cuba. They were there to make a ton of money off gambling scam, just like they would be later in Las Vegas. So those are two big connections.
Where would you say the sufficient evidence? Because whenever I bring up the claim that, like, I would think, my opinion, obviously, would be that the military industrial complex took JFK out. And the way I would back up that claim would be the aspect of, if you look at what the idea of Cuba was at this point, which is trying to get context on what Cuba was. And to me, from what I've read through documents, seems like that it was like, people would say it would be the mafia that took JFK out, or it was Lyndon Johnson, or it was Allen Dulles, or it was all these individual actors. And I go, I think it's a little bit probably more simple than that. There was things that were Kennedy was doing that wasn't good for business assets in Cuba. The involvement we had in Cuba, the rackets, that doesn't just piss off one institution, that pisses off the mafia, that pisses off the CIA. Is that wrong?
But Robbie, that what I just laid out to you was the connection between the U.S. and Cuba under Eisenhower. That was before the revolution. That was before Kennedy. Kennedy's approach to Cuba, quite frankly, was fully tainted. I mean, Kennedy's approach to geopolitics was neutrality. The big thing that Kennedy had that nobody else had, and you mentioned this fear of communism. Basically, the American political establishment, the military industrial complex, reacted to communism in a programmed knee-jerk fashion. They saw anything that appeared to be anti-American as driven by communists. They had no grasp of nationalism. They had no grasp of anti-imperialism. They couldn't see any of that. If there was a if a regime was being destabilized, if there was a revolution, it had to be the communist behind it. It was an obsession. You almost had to live through this to fully relate to it. But Kennedy, because of his extensive travels, his education, recognized that there were a lot of these factors from Southeast Asia to Africa to Cuba. So his view of Cuba was very much, he could understand Cuban nationalism. He could understand Cuban desires to be free of the American mercantile, the business complex. I'm not going to call it military industrial. It was a business complex. So his initial approach, if you look at his, before his election, he was not hostile at all towards Cuba or Castro, just as he was not hostile, generally speaking, he's hostile towards communism, but it was a very sophisticated kind of like, let's take it on a case-by-case basis. The problem is that after the Bay of Pigs and after the disaster in Cuba, basically Kennedy got trapped into this battle with Cuba, and he got sucked into, oh, we have to overthrow Castro. And of course, when Castro brought in the Russian missiles, that solidified that. I mean, what is JFK going to do from a Cuban standpoint? He has to either get Castro out or somehow changed the whole equation with Cuba that has evolved after the Bay of Pigs. But you got to look at Kennedy and Cuba and the U.S. post 1961 as compared to pre 1961. Totally different stories. And of course, as you know, what Kennedy was doing in the fall of 1963 was starting a dialogue with Castro that might very well have turned Cuba neutral, just like Laos, just like Angola, just like India, like Indonesia. All of these places that Kennedy and his administration had been working to neutralize to keep out of the communist camp rather than to regime change and fight and like open combat.
I guess maybe I didn't articulate my words correctly. I think we're saying the same thing. What I was saying is that the way that Cuba was running before even Kennedy even took office, it just right they had all their business assets in Cuba. It turned into this, like you said, like a Las Vegas in a sense. You know, people would go down there, gamble, and make their money. So what Kennedy was doing, trying to make trade deals or backdoor agreements with Castro, wasn't good for the business aspect, where you looked at Allen Dulles and what he was doing with like the amount of equipment they had involved in the Bay of Pigs that was over there that Kennedy didn't know about. Kennedy not launching a missile strike, they're looking at like, we need to make sure that we keep hold on our business. Castro's looking at it like, hey, you're coming onto my land and you're making a lot of money over here and you're turning it into your profit thing, not my place anymore. And Kennedy's making agreements with Castro now. Now you're looking at the aspect of how the military was running, which is be hard on communism, be hard and tough. They wanted more power over in Cuba. They wanted to kind of take it over in a sense. And Kennedy wasn't about that. And we saw that with the Bay of Pigs, where he didn't supply air support. That was if you look from a business aspect, if they get more troops over there, they get enough people to overthrow Castro or do whatever they need to take control of Cuba a little bit more, and their business is going to be better. Their business is going to be easier. And Kennedy kind of looked like he wasn't really supplying the support that they needed for that. So now you're against their business motives. I mean, that's the only way I can see the Texas Oil Company really getting dragged in on a lot of this as well, too, is Dulles had agreements with these oil companies. And you start realizing that not just the mafia, but the oil companies, the government, they were all involved in making a lot of money with Cuba. And now you have this aspect of Kennedy, which is not like Eisenhower being tough on, if you, this idea of tough on communism, I understand, but I also look at like what's behind that. And what's behind that is making money. This idea of we got to be tough on communism, the major motive, in my opinion, will be keeping your money assets. It's like having your money overseas. Are you just going to leave it unprotected, or are you going to leave it in the hands of people that you don't like? You got all your business assets, and Cuba is your moneymaker right now. And you got a guy trying to kick you out. And then you're trying to enforce more troops over there. And Kennedy wants to not supply you more troops. So now you're afraid you're going to lose your business profits. That's how I'm speaking of it.
Well, circa 1962, 63, after the revolution, there were no American companies making money in Cuba. There were no American gambling interests making money in Cuba. Okay. Cuba, everything had been nationalized. Castro had taken over the casino business. Uh, you know, there was an economic ban and embargo. So literally everybody had stopped making money. So I will agree. I'll absolutely agree that all the factions that you mentioned, whether it's the guys that had been in the casino business before in organized crime, whether it's the business interest, everybody wanted regime change in Cuba so they could get back into business. I mean, and you can find that all over the documents. The Godfathers and the gambling guys were still running and trying to contract by themselves, not through the U.S. government, trying to contract assassinations of Castro in 64 and 65 and 66, strictly on their own money, their own people. So yeah, those people all wanted Castro out to give themselves an opportunity to go back into business in Cuba. And I would also agree the direction that Kennedy was going with Cuba as neutral would have lifted the embargo for trade and that sort of thing, but it would have been he's not replacing Castro. Castro would have maintained his policies towards nationalization and agriculture. So suddenly, if you have normal relations between the U.S. and Cuba, that's not going to give these other guys what they want. That they really wanted they wanted Batista too. They wanted Castro gone and a right-wing anti-communist regime in Cuba. That would give them the entree that you described that they wanted. So no, they were most definitely, there was nobody. Yeah, I mean, we have the records of the meetings. We have the discussions. Um, Not Alan Dulles. I mean, he's gone by that time, but Richard Helms is doing everything he can to sabotage this new emerging dialogue with Castro. The CIA is wholeheartedly against it. The military are yeah, everybody is against it. Kennedy and the State Department are the only ones that are pursuing it. So I, I guess from the context you're talking about, yeah, in 1963, JFK's dialogue with Castro would have given JFK what he needed. It would have kicked the Russians out of Cuba. It would have made Cuba neutral, which would have been a great story for the 1964 elections, but it would not have given the American business interest or the casino guys what they wanted. I would totally agree with that.
Because I'm just trying to understand, because I think when people that probably speak on the same side of me saying the industrial complex probably took Kennedy out, um, people go like, well, the government just wanted more power and Kennedy wasn't doing what they said, so they took him out. I go, it's not that simple. It's actually kind of a little bit more complicated. It's more like there's a couple things that corrupt people's minds and kind of corrupt people in a sense, and that's like money and a lot of power as well too. I don't look at our government like we're always just trying to take over stuff. I go, well, there's a business incentive in Cuba. There's a business thing there. And then look at the other aspect. You're afraid Russia's going to start moving in and take over Cuba. So you want to get there first to make sure that doesn't happen. So, I mean, there's two kind of points I'm looking at, like what could really upset a lot of the investments or a lot of the overseas stuff in Cuba. And I think that's a great motivator is that you start having a person like Kennedy opening up a backdoor channel. You could be surprised that a lot of people don't want that happening because they either want to go over there more, and this relationship, if it's good with Kennedy, might stop that. And that also hurts your business aspect as well too. And if you're thinking like I looked at so many documents from Eisenhower, from Hoover, from Johnson, from all this, there was a lot of like ideas like we got to be tough on communism, we got to be striking hard, we can't really like, you got to press the boot down on their neck a little bit. And I'm like, because you're thinking that if you don't do that, you're going to lose it. So now you have a lot of incentives to really make sure. And that's what probably pissed a lot of people off what Kennedy did. I mean, if you're making good relationship, they don't want a buddy buddy thing. They want something that they can control, they can manipulate, and they can. And that's why I say I'm trying to give a little context to that idea of the military industrial complex took Kennedy out, because people think it's like, oh, you think our government's just assassinating people left and right? I'm like, no, I don't think that at all. I think it's more complicated than that. You probably land on some strikes. I know me and you talked about Bay of Pigs being a strike, other things that Kennedy did, Northwoods being a strike as well too. You know, things that he obviously wasn't agreeing with the company line, I would say. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think it's probably a lot of business stuff. A lot of if we don't do this, then Russia's going to probably take it over. I mean, you know, from looking through documents, how many UAP stuff have you come across where you're like, is this Russian propaganda? Is this Russian machine? That was their first thought, was that it was a Russia thing, not a UFO thing, not an alien thing.
I think so. Let's dial down on 1963, in the summer of 1963. So
I'm
what you
trying.
said is certainly American business interest certainly would be opposing any agreement with Castro. This is not going to make them happy. The casino guys are going to be opposing any of that. Um, the the CIA is going to be opposing it because they really think JFK is being naive, you know, that he's going to be out negotiated by Castro. But the other factor that enters into it on the military side, which you may not have run across, is in 1962 and 1963, JFK had been very supportive of military action against Cuba. He had actually ordered and directed the military to put together a gigantic exercise in the Caribbean there was a simulated invasion of Cuba. They put task force out, they put Marines on them. They were actually going to conduct a large scale invasion and landing on an island in the Caribbean, just to kind of get to the message across to Castro that JFK has not given up military action against Cuba. JFK played all of these cards at the same time, which was a very dangerous deal. The other thing is that, and you talked about Northwoods, but again, most people don't understand that JFK had issued directives in the summer of 1963 for the Commander in Chief Atlantic and the Joint Chiefs to put together a brand new program of covert military operations against Cuba. The whole plan was that by the end of the year, all of those actions that the CIA was conducting against Cuba were going to continue, but they were going to be done by the military. This is the same thing that JFK had done in Vietnam, taking away all covert military operations from the CIA and giving them to the military. So I would just shade this a little bit. It's not like JFK was not engaged with the American military over Cuba. If you want to, yeah, the military would like to have just gone in. I mean, if you ask the Commander in Chief Atlantic, and he's kind of like, can I just redirect this exercise and let's go to Cuba now? It's not that there wasn't pressure, because they didn't think anything short of military action would get rid of Castro. Even the Cubans that the CIA was working with, everybody thought that the only way to change regime in Cuba was to kill Castro, to get rid of Castro. You've got to take direct action. Otherwise, he has such control over the population, the regime is not going to change, which actually is one of the things that convinced JFK, kind of like, well, Castro has that strong a hold on Cuba, and if I don't want to go to war, my only hope is some kind of negotiations. And if you look at the documents coming out of the National Security Council and JFK, I would say, is not the only one that's talking about it. You look at those documents starting in about March, April, and the dialogue in all those meetings it starts to be, should we be talking with Castro? Is there some kind of an accommodation? We just, everything was up in the air. So I'm just trying to put a shading on that, the situation with it wasn't an integrated military industrial complex. Everybody had their own agendas.
Yeah, I that's probably where I agree with as well too. I don't think Kennedy is like a sweetheart in this whole situation. I definitely think that obviously he recognized Castro as being an issue as well too. I agree that he was part of definitely a lot of those plots to kill Castro, but I also thought let's give I guess talking a shot, see if that works. And I think that's where the backdoor channels start opening up. You know what I mean? Like, try it. If it does, let's see what happens with it. And I think to them, they thought it would probably fail. Everyone else that really didn't like that agreement being opened up, and they knew it was going to fail, or they thought heavily that it was going to fail. And that's when you start seeing them have, I guess, eyes towards Kennedy of being like, hey, we're not liking where this is going. We don't think it's going to go good. You can whisper in somebody's ear and, be the devil on the shoulder in a sense. And I think he was willing to give it a shot, but I don't consider that his only mess up though. I think there's just a lot of other things that are boiling down that we're not seeing. I mean, even if Dulles is technically fired at this time, I mean, he's still giving advice to CIA directors and other people that are involved in the CIA. They're coming to him when he's supposedly not supposed to be working at the CIA anymore. Didn't they find him on like a farm or something as well too?
Oh yeah. I mean, Helms, nobody ever leaves the CIA.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
That's just a given. Okay. They continue talking to each other. The fact that Dulles would continue to be involved in those dialogues is, yeah, this is just happening. But yeah, I would say, what I would say is JFK put him, as a matter of fact, we have a statement from one of JFK's advisors that literally says, I took a walk with JFK in the Rose Garden, that summer, that early fall. And I said, Jack, you realize what a fine line you're treading? you have like two approaches that you're taking. You got one hard-nosed approach with the military, you're still running all these CIA programs. You haven't stopped any of them. As a matter of fact, you started new ones. In August and September, we have three major new projects that JFK allows to be kicked off to take out, to do regime change. Okay. So it's like you're still doing all of this stuff for regime change to take out Fidel. And at the same time, you're going to be negotiating. You realize how high risk this is? You got people on both sides of the spectrum that are going to be gunning for you. You can't do this. And JFK says, well, sure, I can. And one of the issues that we've all known about Kennedy was kind of like, he was very confident. Both Kennedys were very confident, and they were risk takers. They were willing to roll the dice. So it's not like Jack was not going into this stuff knowing that he was exposing himself to these different threats, for that matter.
When we talk about the assassination plots on Castro, I mean, they had like poison cigars, explosive cigars, a bunch of things. Who was in charge of running those programs or delivering those cigars or just doing the assassination attempts in the first place? Was that Kennedy that drew those up, or was that somebody else?
Yeah, totally done within the CIA. Different people at different times. The people that did it circa 1960 before the Bay of Pigs were different than the people that did it after the Bay of Pigs. They were just like, I could name 4 or 5 people over a period of time, because the CIA, these projects for regime change were kept ongoing. Did Kennedy order anything specific? No, you don't get deniability if you do that. The CIA goes ahead with what it thinks might work. In 1963, for example, even in the summer and fall of 1963, Tracy Barnes, who had taken over the anti-Castro project directly and put in place by John Kennedy, was talking to a guy named Quabella, and Quabella was coming to Barnes and saying, the only way to do regime change is to kill Castro. Give me a gun, give me poison. And there was a little bit of pushback, because that's not what they really wanted, but they were talking to Quabella about assassination. And one of the things we know right now is Quabella was relaying all this information about Castro. So even in 1963, you've got a guy who's appointed by Kennedy working on his own. Okay. Desmond Fitzgerald working on his own in projects that did have discussion of assassination. Like, how can we get this rifle into Quabella? And they actually got to the point of talking about a pin that could be used, like a single shot pin. What can this guy carry into a meeting to take him out? So those dialogues about killing Castro were still in play in the fall of 1963, and Kennedy knew nothing about it. But he had authorized. That's the trick. He was letting these new anti-Castro regime programs go full ahead, and he had even approved a whole set of new sabotage missions that were supposed to start in October and November. So think about this. He's just approved a whole set of new sabotage missions. At the same time, he's sending people to do these back channel negotiations with Castro. I mean, he was a risk taker.
There's a backup plan.
Yeah, and it's like, which was the backup plan for which? We got a plan A and B and maybe a plan C. We don't know which is the backup.
Well, it's like I mentioned to you in the beginning about the assassination things, when there's all these like weird little, like, you have them hanging out with right-wing Russians, Oswald, and then you have them having communist papers in his hand. Like, where was he? And you realize they're just multiple people running the same race, but one person comes in first. So it's kind of like, who's it going to be? I don't know. I mean, hey, if the backdoor channels work, great. If it doesn't, we also can kill them. Like, there's that kind of talk. So that gives me more context, because I'm thinking like Kennedy didn't know about a lot of these assassination plots. But my question was going to be, who are the mafia people that were connected in this as well too? because from David Talbot, he told me that Dallas, when he flew to Rome or whatever, was to gather this assassination team, the same people that were part of the plot to kill Castro, and brought them to Dallas. And it brings up, okay, well, who are those people?
Well, Joan Roselli was definitely from the very beginning when the idea of killing Castro as part of the Cuba project was first floated. I mean, that was under Eisenhower. That was in 1960. When that was first floated, uh, basically there was an outreach, and what they needed to find was someone who had great connections in Havana. Okay, who could get in poison, who could arrange an assassination, and they ended up with John Roselli. Roselli had been the guy that I had mentioned that Meyer Lansky had sent into Cuba to straighten out the casinos and bring them into line and cure their PR problem. Roselli made absolute sense. Roselli was his business card says John Roselli, strategist. I mean, this is the guy who collects money on the East Coast and invested in the film industry in LA or in Las Vegas. This guy puts things together. That's what he does. So they get him. He's involved in the very first efforts to poison Castro before the Bay of Pigs that almost worked. I mean, it was simply a fluke that Castro did not die before the Bay of Pigs. It's there's a story there, but it could very well, the Bay of Pigs could very well have worked if that assassination had happened, and if he had been poisoned. After the Bay of Pigs, when they restart the Cuba project under William Harvey goes back to Roselli. So in 1962, 1963, Roselli continues to be involved in efforts to assassinate Castro. Those include not just poison, but actually sniper teams using Cuban exiles. So Roselli is the constant throughout the whole thing, as far as the mafia is concerned, as far as organized crime. I mean, Roselli himself was not a godfather. Roselli was a facilitator. Roselli made his money by doing deals. But he considered himself very patriotic, and he was happy to work with the CIA. So Roselli would be the name that continues all the way into 1963. If you want to bring in the organized crime connection, if you want to find somebody that can bring Jack Ruby in, it's John Roselli. If you want to find somebody that can get some money into Dallas to do things, it's John Roselli. He has those connections, and he's had connections to Jack Ruby all the way back to 1960. You mentioned, Robbie, you mentioned Ruby's gun running. Ruby's gun running really didn't work. What did work was Ruby carried cash into Cuba to bail Traficante out and get him out of jail. And Ruby also arranged a big sale of Jeeps to blackmail some officials in the Castro government. And all of that was done with Ruby being kind of a low-level courier organizer for the interest out of Vegas, who Roselli was involved with. So again, I would put Roselli's name forward as being the guy that would organize resources as far as a conspiracy is concerned, and with connections to Dallas and to Ruby. We know that one of the guys that Jack was making phone calls to in L.A. was part of a gambling group that Roselli was working with at the same time, making some money off his illegal card games.
When we talk about the assassination attempts on Castro, did Castro try to assassinate JFK? I mean, just once out of all the times we tried to assassinate him. I thought I remember reading about Cuban resistance or Cuban exile people with assassination attempts on Kennedy. I didn't know if that was a government created one or if that was Castro.
Yeah, there was a great concern that he would. Actually, interestingly, circa 1962, you will find a file that's titled Castro Attempts to Assassinate JFK. When they investigated that, it turned out to be a disinformation campaign coming from the Cuban exiles who were trying to set it up to plant rumors that that's what Castro was doing. Uh, but the point of fact, there was enough concern that that was going to happen that a group was set up to do contingency planning if Castro did begin to assassinate not just JFK, but American State Department people in Latin America, or if he were, if he started pushing back. Interestingly enough, the guy in charge of this group to do contingency planning against a Castro assassination effort was none other than William Harvey, the guy who had been running John Roselli in assassination efforts against Castro. I mean, you gotta love that sort of stuff.
Coincidence. The idea of like there's no conspiracy behind it, man. I'm just telling you, I go by the documents, what the documents are telling me, and the documents from the number of people, Castro, Khrushchev, even some people that talked about it was a Zionist conspiracy. It was from like the Palestinians. I mean, whether you agree with how crazy, like they blamed more of like the Jewish angle on things, but I mean, the idea that there was this one person that killed the president, and I know the argument to that is always, well, you could either bring up the Walker assassination attempt, which I thought, when I talked to Posner, that was the thing I talked about. I don't think that happened. I don't think he tried to assassinate Walker, because I think Walker stated later that it was Oswald. And I think from the witness accounts in the area, there were two people, not just one. So it wouldn't be that lone gunman thing. But then it's just like this weird thing where you got like Oswald in the middle of everything. And then now it makes more sense if we talk about Ruby's gun running, and you start looking at Ruby's connections with Roselli. And then you start looking at this aspect of, imagine Ruby wasn't a big fish. We know that he was a small guy on the chain, but now you can answer the question of why was he surveilling Oswald? Why was he stalking Oswald? Well, he's picking out a patsy. He's picking out someone that could easily be the cover up to something like this. And I know it's like, okay, well, what evidence is that? I'm like, well, there's plenty of it there, but we don't have a document that says like Ruby was looking for Oswald. It's just hard to examine this 24-year-old. And I mean, even some of the things, like I was reading through the Warren Commission statement in the Warren Commission this morning that I just read, talking about Lee's rifle. Marina identified the rifle to be of Lee Harvey Oswald, a faithful rifle, whatever he called it. But then it goes on to say that he bought this rifle when he came back from Russia in 62, and it was bought in March in March of 1963. Well, I have the House Select Committee of Assassinations document that I pulled up on air. If you caught my Posner episode, you saw I pulled it up there. She doesn't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun, so you have to throw her testimony out. They even said she could not identify, I think it's CE199. She could not identify the rifle back in 63 and could not identify it now, and it would be wasting the court's time to make her try and do so. Then you have the idea of, okay, you got this Oswald guy. Apparently, like I said, we're going to talk about this topic because you told me you're getting interested in looking at a second version of Oswald, or looking into Oswald a little bit. But he's on the back porch and he's looking out his rifle and he's practicing reloading it. And that sounds very, very like, oh, perfect. This is the perfect evidence for it. And then you hear like she gave a statement to the House Select Committee on Assassinations on Volume 2 talking about, I never really like paid attention when he played with his rifle. I didn't know where he kept it. I didn't bother to look. She wasn't interested in any of that. So she didn't even think to take account of the sound of him reloading it or testing it out or doing whatever on the back porch, like the Warren Commission says. So there's already a fault in the Warren Commission right there. That's clear as day. But I don't get it. My issue out of this whole JFK thing is the history books are reading off the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was in 1963 or 1964, whichever one you want to say. House Select Committee of Assassinations that went through all the work the Warren Commission did and found out plenty of new evidence was way later, but the history books are going after the Warren Commission. So now it should be looking at the most recent investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And that's what the history books should be saying, all the things that they have proven wrong. So right now you are in a rough point right now where society is being taught the original version, not the new evidence and all the stuff that has come out now. So then when any of these talks happen, if you're not on the official side, they think you're a conspiracy person, and that's not true. So I mean, that's reasonable, right? That's not insane. Like I'm not going out there saying like I said, I don't know if Oswald wasn't at least up on that building. I don't know, but I definitely don't agree that it was just one shooter. I had Don Thomas on here, and he supports the acoustical evidence. And I know some researchers don't even give that any time of day. But I mean, that even that, if you don't agree that the Zapruder film's altered, you can match up the acoustical evidence with the Zapruder film, and it matches up almost to a T, he said. I mean, it's 5 shots that they accounted, 5 noise things that go out there. And I know it's the idea of like a motorcycle that was recording something and all that. I get that. I mean, like I said, if I don't agree with it, there's still weight behind the argument that it's still not one lone gunman.
Yeah, I think, and I think there's a very good point there. It's like history gets better over time. We know more about any event years later than we do immediately after. There's just no doubt about that. You can take any subject that's written about in history, and if you look at what's written in the media, at the time, or you look at a police report of an incident at the time, and then you come back, and let's say this is something fairly significant, you come back and you look at it a decade later, or you look at it 2 decades later, and there's a lot more information about it that wasn't available. So anybody that reached a conclusion in 1964, as the Warren Commission did, uh, writing your history book based on 1964 is clearly not going to be as accurate as writing your history book on what's emerged during the following 3 or 4 decades. So that is a real problem with history and history books in general that you've highlighted. I mean, it actually is worse than just the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which did find and report on a conspiracy. I mean, the HSCA actually wrote a memo to the Justice Department saying you need to reopen the Kennedy assassination. You need to make it a priority criminal investigation because everything that we found, not just the acoustics, but other things that we found show that it was not properly investigated. A lot of the evidence that was offered is questionable. You guys need to reopen a criminal investigation. Justice did not do so. So the most recent cut of this history is from American history is really, yes, a commission investigated the work of the Warren Commission, found it was sadly lacking, and then the Justice Department refused to respond to them. Even more recently, of course, we have the ARRB, the assassinations research effort that occurred in the 90s, and the documentation obtained by the ARRB brings even more things into question. And I think at this point in time, it's foolish to say that any of the evidentiary material offered by the Warren Commission is valid. I mean, between the work of the HSCA and the ARB, there's none of it that remains not open to question. There was just so much that was done that was sloppy, that was incorrect, it was whatever. So if you were writing your history book based on the work of the ARB, let's just take something very simple, which I think is a classic example. The ARB interviews the autopsy doctors. They say, here are the pictures offered in evidence of the president's head wound. Show us where he was shot. The autopsy doctor says, sorry, I can't do it. It's like, wait a minute, you were there. Your information is the backbone of this whole case against Lee Oswald, and you can't show me where the president was shot? Nope, sorry. And the doctor even goes so far as, this is a paraphrase, to say something like, well, good luck with figuring it out, because what you're showing me, I don't know. It's like, wait a minute. If I was writing my history book on that, what would you say? I would write a short sentence about the assassination of President Kennedy that just simply says, we wish we knew what had happened, but we don't. We can't say for sure what did happen. It just, It's amazing. But I do think it's interesting there. I have seen more and more references, not necessarily in history books, but to the quote unquote alleged assassin, which I think is a good trend. It's sort of like no case was ever made against Lee Oswald, and Lee Oswald was not convicted in the court. You cannot say he assassinated President Kennedy. He was never convicted of that crime.
That's 100% true. But every PBS and every documentary that you see that happens to do with Lee Harvey Oswald talks about how he killed the president. Like you just type in Lee Harvey Oswald backyard photographs and everything will tell you the Lee Harvey Oswald's backyard photographs, that obviously the best evidence against him that he killed the president. There's no alleged in there. I've seen some more recent stuff when we talk about the topic again about alleged assassin. I've seen that 100%. I just think it's because if you start examining a lot of the stuff, a lot of the things don't really add up. Like I mentioned to you when what was that? What was that?
Yeah, they definitely don't add up in any direction, vertically, laterally. No.
Magic bullet, upside down, all that. But I think like especially learning more about the case and everything as well too. I think the argument usually gets brought up when you talk about the military industrial complex is like, do you really think our government could pull all that off? And I go, I don't honestly think, I think it's unintended consequences. I think it's an unintended thing that happened. All this stuff did. I think if you look at the aspect, like we talk about the backyard photographs, I'll give my example real quick and people can just understand this is my perspective. I don't really have any evidence on this besides basing it off of the same 24-year-old perspective, I guess. Kids nowadays, they Photoshop their faces and all this type of stuff on devices and they do all this. And you have now Oswald looking at his examination in the Stovall company. You did mention that these photos obviously came out afterwards. I don't know when he would have created these photos. Maybe he created them and then they didn't come to light until afterwards. I have no clue. Allegedly, that's what they found in their investigation is these photos came out then. Maybe they came out before, but that's what they dated at. We know archaeologists to date things, and next, 10 years later, it gets back even farther than that. I'm just using that perspective, but I get to this point where you had a guy mention that this is my face, but this is not me in this photo. There's something different. And people talk about that chin line. Now, instead of going the crazy conspiracy route that it's the government that faked photos and did all this, I take a more common example. You had a guy
and did
that
a poor job of it, right? Did a poor job of it too.
You had a guy that worked at a photography place and decided that maybe he found a photo or something of a person holding a rifle, the fair play for Cuba papers and all this type of stuff. But that's the weird part that doesn't fit my story. It doesn't fit of why that guy would be having the .38, the rifle, and the fair play magazine. So someone had to add something to that photo. Maybe they did add Oswald's face in. I try to look at the perspective of if he created the AJ Heidel idea as practice or having fun at his work, maybe possibly one of the things that could have got him fired for sure. I just get to this aspect of if he created an ID, maybe he faked the photograph. And that's why George de Mohrenschildt has this photo saying hunting fascists and it's signed by Oswald or it's in block letter Russian. And I go, he's probably trying to come off like a badass and impress his friends. George de Mohrenschildt, a connection, a guy who is obviously known to have some ties with the government and be this kind of powerful figure in a sense compared to Oswald, which everyone mentions a loner and all these types of things. He's probably trying to impress them. George de Mohrenschildt probably didn't buy it, but now that you have Oswald in custody, you can now look at this as like, hey, I mean, if he's going to be the patsy, I might as well get something for myself. And then you release a photo showing it. I mean, I've heard stories of Marina talking to Oswald's mother and talking about, oh my God, I have this photo. What should I do with it? And apparently showed him in the jail cell. Like, I had this photo in my shoe and it's of you. Should I destroy it? And apparently she ripped it up and flushed it down the toilet. Okay. But we get to the aspect of this relationship with Oswald and his mother. This is the thing I don't get. People say Oswald hated his mother. I go, yo, I'm 24. I'm pretty sure I've said I hated my mother multiple times. Like it's a common thing. But the one thing I use as evidence is that she knew a lot about Oswald, like his emotional, his like everything like a mother would know if you talk to her all the time. So I go, maybe Oswald's not communicating with his mother, but Oswald's talking to his wife. And we see in the video where it's his wife and his kids and it's his mother walking through that building. So we go, okay, so maybe Marina's communicating with Oswald's mother, and that's how she knows all this stuff about him being a CIA agent. And then I get to the aspect of this. We have that, I think I showed it on air to David Denton and Randy Benson, but there's a document from a lady from a review board that not the ARB or anything like that. It's a research review board is what it was called on the title of the document, but it was to the CIA about an interview with Oswald. Do you have any files or a debrief on Oswald? We have an agent named Dementia that says that he debriefed a person who worked at a radio factory in Minsk. And they go, no, we don't have any files on that. Well, the agent, here's his statement. And he said, you did. And the agent's statement said, that was a debrief. What I did was a debrief. The CIA sent a document back of Oswald's CIA file where he was interviewed, but they didn't classify it as a debrief. So it's like legal speak. You ask for a debrief. We don't classify that as a debrief, so I don't have to give it to you. And then they came out saying, yeah, he did. So I go, did someone pick up Oswald, have him do all these weird CIA tactics, why he looks like he has intelligence blueprints, like took him on as like a protege? Maybe one of the CIA directors decided to invest in this young boy. Or you have someone who interviewed for the CIA, thought he was CIA now, and trying to do tactics to fit in. And that's where you see the manipulations of photos. You see this ID, this fake ID that he has. It's like playing fucking cops and robbers. I don't know. I'm trying to understand it all, but I think that's a reasonable take on some things.
I think two views that go along with that. First of all, okay, three views.
Tell me if I'm nuts first. Am I nuts?
Oswald, as his brother said.
Don't ignore me.
Was an adventurous, yeah. Okay, I could come up with even more, but Oswald was an adventurous kid. I mean, he was contrarian. He liked pulling people's chains. He was kind of De Mohrenschuld referred to him as a proto-hippie. This is a guy who is contrary to everything. He has views that are different than everybody around him. He will argue with them. Does he always tell the truth? No, if he gets pushed into a corner, he can lie. Okay, just like all of us can. Kind of like, okay, you caught me. But Oswald did like playing games. So the fact that he would play around with ID, Photoshop, if you will, Photoshop ID, whatever, with his different pieces of ID. The thing is, if you look at them, they're all reasonably sloppy. They're not going to pass muster. This is the sort of stuff that Oswald does for himself. It's not the CIA shop at Langley. When Langley does an ID, you don't figure out it's fake. When Oswald does something like High-Del ID, yeah, okay, it's if you look at it closely enough, it's fake. Oswald
well, hang on a second. Maybe all those people that found the ID and saw that it was a fake, they just were really good detectives, like Dallas police. They were just great detectives. I mean, one of the guy's arrest records was insane. It was like a 99 or something like that.
Yeah,
that's Sherlock Holmes on the force.
Yeah, what they really needed was Dr. Watson, I think. But let's go back to the backyard photo for a minute, because I would like to insert one thing that adds a lot of complexity. We all think of that one photo, and by the way, I got to tell you, if you do a search on the internet and find a song called "Lee Oswald Was My Friend," it's great, but it's a country song.
Is that George Morshield? Or not George Morshield? That's
no,
Frazier. That's Frazier.
This guy. I was stunned when I ran across it. It's like Oswald taught me how to fish. Oswald taught me. We played ball together. Anyway, the point is there are at least 5 different images that are related to the backyard photo. It was not just one photo. It was this person standing at different positions, different angles, whatever. And actually, they collected, I think, I could get this wrong. They collected either 3 or 4.
Well, I thought it was 4.
Well, from the material that was collected in Oswald's, when it was taken into evidence on November 22nd, they were just in a box along with other Oswald photos, including photos of the Walker home. And they were still there on November 22nd. Like, this is whoever took them, planted them all at once, or Oswald just took them and kept them. But there was other photos that turned up that the Dallas police crime lab had apparently leaked. I mean, 2 of them turned up in the personal possessions of Dallas police officers who had nothing to do with this investigation. It's like somebody was passing around images. Geneva White Roscoe White's wife, had one that turned up years later. George de Mohrenschildt had one that turned up years later that had been placed in something that de Mohrenschildt had loaned to Oswald, and they, you know, it was found sometime later. So we're not just talking about one photo. We're talking about a set of images of that are different, um, that turned up at different times and different places. So that kind of makes it more complex than, oh, somebody just altered one photo, somebody, which quite frankly tends to lead me to believe that, yeah, these are real photos. I have to say that, especially with the point that when Oswald's possessions were found and inventoried, there was a copy of The Worker. This is the same publication, and then they verified that Oswald had a subscription to this magazine. The Socialist Workers Party verified that he had a subscription. So, in any event, long story short, I guess what you're saying, Robbie, I certainly can't take everything that Marina said at face value, especially given how much pressure she was, but also given the problems that she was having with Lee. We have to face the fact that in the beginning in February of 1963, Lee Oswald, using Marina's name and with Marina signing off on things, was sending papers to the Soviet embassy in New York to get Marina returned to Russia. The Oswalds were having serious marital problems. So there are a lot of things going on around Oswald in 1963 that we don't often discuss, that, they kind of get buried under all these discussions of the evidence and why the evidence is so suspect. But there are a lot of things that about Oswald, I think, that need to be revisited, if it were, in terms of the total context of Lee Oswald and what he was going through in 1963.
Well, I, I the backyard photographs, even if they're real, I'm like, I don't fight the fight of the backyard photographs. I'm not that type. I'm just trying to see it from both sides here. So if I see it from the side that it's real photographs and something like that, does that still give the the evidence enough to be the guy that kills the president? Like that's the thing, is like I have plenty of photos on my Instagram of me holding up a gun. I did some shooting that day, but I didn't kill anybody. You know what I mean? I didn't kill a deer. I didn't go hunting. I just picture of a rifle, me holding a rifle or something. I'm jacked in the photo. Yeah, I know. But it's just a bragging thing. I mean, we know from Michael Payne that apparently Michael Payne saw the photo that Oswald had. So you can look at that at one of two ways. One, look how cool I look in this photo. It's pretty cool, right? Or look at this Photoshop I did, and do you think it's pretty good, right? You got two angles to look at it from, but to me, it doesn't give me the evidence. Like, I haven't seen a lot that really paints him as this, at least enough strong evidence that paints him as this person that could kill Kennedy. But I still don't toss that out. I say it could be possible that he was up there, but I also go back to, like I said before, we know that the rifle that the Warren Commission said his wife picked out is not valid. You cannot use that statement because the House Select Committee already interviewed Marina and she couldn't decipher the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. But I point to this. So I work at my work. I talk to someone about, I'm always talking about the Kennedy assassination. And a guy comes in, he goes, I could tell you it was one guy. And I go, how do you know? And he goes, just go up into that building. You could hear it. You could just know somebody can make that shot easy. Like, you just see it. And I go, well, what do you mean? What evidence is that? He goes, I know. Yeah. Hold your head like that. That's what I did. And he goes, look, I stock for Pepsi back then. I used to stock Pepsis at that place. And I go, well, hang on a second. Oswald was caught on the second floor with a Coke. That's where I start questioning that. If they're stocking Pepsis at that book depository building, then how does Oswald have a Coke? But what you do hear, one thing you do hear is that when they went up there to go check for the rifle, that apparently they found a bagged lunch with some chicken bones in it. And what? A Dr. Pepper, not a Coke, a Dr. Pepper. So now that's a Pepsi product. So now I kind of validate what he said about stocking. I don't validate that just go up there and you can believe one shot, but I validate, let's say he stocked Pepsis at that place when he was a kid back then. The guy's older. He's definitely stocking Pepsis at that. He said around that time period. So I go, is the Coke thing real? Is he really drinking a Coke on the second floor? Or do you validate the Dr. Pepper they found up top? That's a Pepsi product, probably one of the things that he was stocking. So you get into this aspect of, was Oswald even up there, or was Oswald even on the second floor? And that's a tough thing. It brings up that question of prayer, man, that people don't like talking about. But I think there's, like I said, there's reasonable things, which each conspiracy thing you go down, there's a lot of like weight and a lot of things that are kind of covered in a sense where I don't think it's so easily cut dry is my whole thing. I want to, like I'm looking at it from, I don't think it can just be so simple as one person. And usually the argument that you can't, it's hard to refute, which is, oh, people never think it could be one person that could just kill the president. And I'm just like, okay, hang on a second. To say there's not somebody that's lying in this whole thing or someone that's not doing something right, whether it's the Secret Service, whether it's a bunch of things, they were drinking the night before. They all should have lost their jobs, but they didn't. So you now have an aspect of someone didn't pay the price for that incident that went on. Kennedy did, Oswald did later, but something's not adding up in all this. And I think that's why you get a lot of people that are interested in, why I'm so interested in as well too.
Well, and I think to give a little credit where credit's due, just not to leave the backyard photos, Oswald did make that assertion. It's not me, it's whatever. I don't know if you've seen them, but there's a series of photos that the Dallas police did themselves to test that. There's a Dallas police detective who posed with a rifle and a newspaper in the backyard because the Dallas police themselves wanted to study the angles, they wanted to study the image. So the Dallas police at least considered the possibility that the photos might have been hoaxed. And I think that's very interesting. That doesn't get talked about very much. You have to look to find those photos, but they did even investigate that aspect of it. But I mean, kind of put a bow on it. I think what I do is I absolutely agree with you, Robbie. The photos by themselves,
I'm more
especially,
knowledgeable than our last talk, aren't I? I'm getting there. I'm getting there a
yeah,
little bit.
the photos by
Slowly.
themselves prove nothing about the assassination. All they show you is a guy strutting his stuff because frankly, that's a pose. Whoever's doing it, it's a pose. You don't have a rifle and a pistol. And when it's signed off, it says Hunter of Fascist, and that particular version of it is sent to Des Moines Shield. You got to say, this is, I won't call it posing, but this is kind of like a tweak.
Well, Jesus
You
Christ,
said I
man.
wasn't.
He's holding the rifle, he's holding the papers in his hand, he's holding the pistol. I'm like, I've seen people take a photo with a fucking beer to make sure everyone knows that they're drinking and partying and stuff, but that's nuts, man. That's
This is like a selfie in 1963. Okay, come on. This is the first selfie. Like you said I was nothing. You said but look, I'm going to prove I'm really serious. Right?
honey,
Okay.
grab all our badass shit and let me wear it real quick for this photo.
Now, does that mean anything about the assassination? The only thing it means is when that photo was found, one of them was found, the one that kind of looks the most incriminating, and was supplied to Life magazine to print on the cover. That sells Lee Oswald as a lone assassin. I mean, the only relevance it really has is it's a media trick. It's found and it's immediately put into print to sell him as a lone nut assassin. What if he had not? What if those photos had not been found? What would they have used? What would have meant? It's sometimes there are coincidences.
I think this was something that definitely, when it came out, it definitely didn't add to his case when it came to his innocence. But I've asked the question, and it's something I think is important to talk about, which is the trial by media. If you are already being prosecuted by, the government in a sense, and now the people, if you're trying to go from their good side. You're trying to get a fair trial. I don't think that could have even happened with all the things that were being pushed against him, because you already had the media selling him as this crazy nut job assassin type thing. I mean, look at the example I could use for would be Vincent Bugliosi, the guy that everyone mentions as this writing this great book about Kennedy. Did you not see all the crap Tom O'Neill found out about him about during the Manson murders? He hired a prosecutor on the defendants, so to sabotage the case. He committed perjury in a murder trial, which is punishable by death. That's back then. And you start realizing it's like, okay, when we talk about media, we talk about the power that they have, the influence that they have. You're showing a picture of a guy holding the most incriminating things that line up for his case of being the lone assassin. Now you're seeing people see that and go, oh my God, he needs to die. He needs to reach trial. I bet if he wouldn't have died and there would have been a trial, I don't think he would have gotten to be innocent anyway. He would have not gotten a fair trial from any witnesses or anybody that would be on that jury that would, even if he had the best lawyer in the world. You already are shunned in the eyes of the public. We know a headline that comes out, and then we see the real story of things, and we realize, oh God, well, most people see the headline, not the retraction.
Where are you going to collect a jury? I mean, I can just see the
Canada.
defense lawyers. First motion, Judge, I need a change of venue. We need to take this like to Patagonia or Iceland, or, I'm not going to get a fair trial, not just in Texas. I'm not going to get a fair trial anywhere in the civilized world because
Find somebody
everybody's
ice
already
fishing.
seen this picture.
Find somebody ice fishing and see if they'll play on the jury. But I mean, that's an important factor. I think when we look at like one of the questions I always had and kind of where I'm focusing right now, besides like Jack Ruby still, because that's just, I like the MK Ultra stuff. I don't care if anybody else wants to talk about it but me, but that's nuts, man. But if we talk about when it comes to media power, I mean, Life magazine bought the Zapruder film and then had it locked away basically for a while. So you get into this era of why is Life magazine so powerful? Who's the connections with Life magazine? Who's the connections with the media outlet? And then we have that 1035 960 document that talks about, label all these things as conspiracies. Make sure new evidence that comes out against the Warren Commission is properly treated as a nut job conspiracy. And at the bottom of the document says destroy when no longer needed. I mean, that's a damning document. Whether you agree it's a lone nut or not, that sets the record for showing you how the government can influence things. And I do agree with Dave Talbot's example of the way that Dulles thinks about things. He's a patriot. He thinks this is how you got to be to make sure America's safe. That means all these things that we label him as or drastically see him do, these extreme examples where today's society would be like, oh my God, that's horrible. To him, he's not thinking of it like that. He's like, I'm going to do what needs to be done that no one else is going to do. And that's where you have a lot of the things that Dulles does.
And there was no compunction. I mean, we're at war with communism. There's no compunction about using the media. The media are just another tool. And quite frankly, a lot of the people in the media feel the same way. It's not like they're going to oppose being used. They're engaged in this same battle. So when you talk about Life magazine was probably, and the loose media network were probably the biggest promoters of the anti-Castro thing. Kennedy caught more flack from the loose media network than anybody else. So, the media is part of the story. And I think one of the most dramatic things that I still refuse to accept, if you're talking about media complicity, the media has the Zapruder film, right? We do the first issue of where the Zapruder film ever shows up. Now, it's going to show up in Life magazine and never again be seen by anybody until Garrison gets it and releases it years later.
I thought it was Geraldo Rivera.
Well, yeah, Garrison got a leaked copy. And bootleg copies started to be made about that time. Not everybody saw it, but that the point being is that in the Life magazine, when the frames are printed, 3 of them get printed out of sequence. So it looks like the president's shot from the back and falling forward. And Life has to do a retraction saying, oh, we made a mistake. How many people know about this retraction? Nobody know about this attraction, and it's simply blamed on some poor editor down in the basement who somehow got these frames switched up. Now, this is the most important story that anybody's going to ever work with, that it's going to be double checked and triple checked. Yet this one guy at Life magazine has switched the frames around to give a completely different image of how the president is shot from the rear rather than the front. Do I really think it happened that way? I don't really think it happened that way. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, Fred did that and nobody took a look at what he did before we printed it. Oh gosh. Oh, by the way, did we discipline Fred? No, he's in, he's in the Bahamas now.
When you said that, I just picture if this guy was still alive hearing you say that, he was like, Jesus Christ, it was one mistake. Give me a break.
Yeah,
but
give me a break.
when you lay it out like that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like I never thought of the backyard photographs until Paul mentioned it to me, and was like, if you look at the rifle, the papers in his hand, and the thing on his pocket, I mean, that's all three things that I was like, yeah, I never thought of it like that. There's things about the Warren Commission, even I'm reading it and I'm like jumping on the gun. Like I saw, oh, he got the rifle when he got back from 1962, and then it's a period, and then it says, but rifle was purchased in March of 63. And I'm like, wait a minute. So they just said, but you have to reread it again and realize, oh no, he got the rifle when he got back from Russia. And then, but it's that confusion. It's like kind of like legal speak in a sense. I mean, they're not writing it out like he bought a rifle in March of 1963 when he came back from Russia in 62. That's how you should have read it. But they read it, he came from Russia and then got a rifle from 62, but he bought it in 63. It's like, well, who wrote this? I get it. It's a lot of work. The Warren Commission's a lot. But when you're reading it, you're starting to see things where you're like, okay, is this the smoking gun? Is this? Are they laying it out for you?
I just got through rereading this section of the Warren Commission on Oswald, which supposedly is discussing motive and everything. And because I know a lot of the stuff that they're writing from, not what they're writing, it's like, oh man, they left out, it's cherry picking. They quote this one guy who knew Oswald. They put in this, they leave out all the other stuff. Here's another person who knew Oswald. They use it was written. We've all got to keep in mind the fact that when the FBI was told to investigate the crime, the FBI was ordered on Sunday afternoon after the assassination to write a report proving Lee Oswald was the lone assassin. Now, you're working in an office, right? You know what's coming down. I know what kind of report you didn't tell me to do an investigation. You didn't tell me to be a crime solver. You didn't tell me to do a detective. You told me to write a report showing that this guy is guilty and he's only one guilty. If I'm going to keep my job, I know exactly what kind of report I'm going to write. I take that report and I give it to the Warren Commission. And the Warren Commission is told by Earl Warren that they need to package this against the FBI's work, because the FBI is the only one that's done any research for them. And we need to write a report that supports this. What would you expect? They know where they're going. It's not like an open-ended inquiry. It's a process to show that Lee Oswald did it. That's it. So I'm not sure why we should even be confused about that anymore. The FBI was told what to do. The Warren Commission was told what to do. And they did it.
I think everyone looks at, when you talk about the military industrial complex, that they all work together. Like the FBI talks to the CIA, and the CIA, dude, the best documents I could tell you to go look for on the Kennedy assassination for me have been from the NSA. They got more stuff that I have not seen in the archives of JFK, that I have not seen on the FBI website, and that I have not seen on the CIA website. They have a bunch of stuff, and a lot of their documents are talking about, we don't trust the FBI's investigation and we don't trust the CIA's investigation. Where I go, look, this idea that our government works together, I think they're all kind of doing their own stuff here, and it seems like everybody's trying to pitch a point.
Yeah, I have exactly the same reaction. When I write something, I found when I'm writing about what the CIA reportedly did, the best reference is the State Department documents, because they generally mistrust And I won't say hate those suckers, but they're more than willing to expose the CIA's bungling. It's like, no, these people do not work. They're competitors. I've got a great document from the FBI that's about James Angleton. And you think, okay, they're like this, right? I mean, he's counterintelligence, they're counterintelligence. They don't even call him out and list him as like having a title. James Angleton to the FBI is simply a source. Like, we're going to write down what he tells us and that's it. No, okay, fine.
Write it down on a file and stick it in a cabinet where
Yeah.
no one will
Do
find
we
it for
believe
60
it?
years.
No, but we'll make a memo.
Larry, man, I appreciate you giving me your time to talk on the podcast, man. You know how interested I've been in the assassination. But where can people find you, man? Any of your links?
The best place to look, the best place to really look is my blog, which is on WordPress. So just do a Larry Hancock on WordPress. All of the books are on Amazon. I do have a Larry-Hancock webpage, which has a fair amount of content on it, documents and that sort of thing. But those are the three places to really find me online.
All right. Well, I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode.